And it's always the same three things, by the way. It's basically tax, borrow, inflate. Gen Xers felt that the only way they could survive is by taking their life rafts and sailing in different directions, because the whole thing was going to sink. Millennials are roping all of their lifeboats together because they realize if the entire S&P goes down, someone's got to save them. History suggests that when society feels that it's entering its more collective mood of not wanting to take individual risk vis-a-vis others, it's more likely to take collective risks. Apple or NVIDIA or Microsoft go down by 30% or 40%. You know that Chairman Powell is going to have an emergency press conference. What people don't understand is that late in a crisis, inflation is always part of it, because inflation is not a problem in that case. It is a solution. Conflict is the incubator of community. It happens every time.
Today on Rabbit Hole, I'm joined by Neil Howe, author of Generations, The Fourth Turning. The Fourth Turning is here. You can find his work at Demography Unplugged. That's where I read it. We're not going to go deep into what generational theory is or the fourth turning. We're going to talk about the now, being the frog in the boiling water of the current crisis. Neil, thanks for joining us. Maybe just a very quick, where are we in your cycle, and how does it feel in terms of how you would expect it to have gone when you started this process 20 years ago?
I have to say, in all honesty, this is played out pretty much as we expected. I probably should say something else. This is completely not what we expected. I will say that, and again, I'm just speaking honestly from when Bill and I first started writing about this, actually in 1991, that was in our book Generations, where we first talked about, American history and by extension, much of Western history being cyclical, modern history being cyclical. We talked about a crisis of the 2020s, and it's in that book, and we foretold something that would be the way this generational cycle plays out would lead to that. Now, at that time, we often thought about something peaking, in the year 2020 or in the early 2020s, right? And I would say the one kind of difference is that due to the lengthening of generations, the slowing of the timing of generations, that I would say we're pushing, the cycle is dilating slightly. And this has happened over time. This actually happened over the centuries. The cycle used to be a bit longer, back in the 17th and 18th century. It shortened a bit at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And I think it's lengthening a bit again. And I think the reason for that is that the timing, the governor of the length of the cycle is the generational phase of life. That is to say, the time it takes from a person to be born to fully come of age as an adult, and then by extension, from being an adult, fully coming into your roles in midlife, which is sort of the leadership phase of life. And then, the elder phase of life is when you're presiding over America's, society's most highest institutions at the highest level. And I think it's fair to say that the time it takes for someone to become an adult in America has lengthened, over the last 30 years. The age at which someone gets married, becomes a parent, has a permanent career. I mean, all of these things are 5 to 7 years later
Right.
than they used to be. The age at which people are actually being elected for political leadership has gone up about 4 or 5 years. And God knows the age at which people are presidents. I mean, it's off the charts, right? So you see what I mean? There's a dilation in phases of life, and that is actually the timing of the cycle. And I talk to a lot of people who say that technology speeds things up. It should be speeding the generational cycle up. Well, we can talk about that if you want, Dave. But I think the cycle has actually slowed down. I think the experience of young adults today is more like the no-growth economic experience of living in the 17th and 18th century than it is to live in the early 20th century when economic mobility and possible full adult phases of life were available much earlier in life than they are today. I think for a lot of young adults, it's just everything is on hold for you guys. You know what I mean?
I think that feels very true. And this is exactly the part of this I wanted to get into, which was the living in its roles issue, because it's one that feels very relevant to me. I'm, I think your definition of Gen X is 65 to 80 roughly in there, which is a little bit shorter than some of the other generations that are alive right now.
It's actually, we define Xers as born in 1961 to 1981. So
okay,
those early 1960s babies, they were about, they were still preschool during Woodstock. You know what I mean?
Right. They're not boomers.
They had the throwaway upbringing of a Gen Xer.
Right.
And they were the ones who started coming of age in the early 80s with the down with disco and the new wave and Michael J. Fox and all that.
Right. And that's right down the middle for me, and sort of my colleagues all sort of fit into that mix. And one thing that has been a topic of conversation amongst sort of peers, mentors, and mentees for the last 5 or 6 years was this feeling that Gen X in particular has sort of never been educated about how to move into the next phase, how to become elders, right? I mean, in your parlance, we were sort of a nomad generation, latchkey kids. And as part of that, it feels like we've missed most of the opportunities to learn what our later roles are supposed to be, or at least historically have been useful to society. Do you have some thoughts about sort of that shift from midlife to eldership and the gap between what we see in the baby boomer generation, which has seemed to be very reluctant to let go of a lot of leadership, and the Gen X community, which honestly feels largely listless, with the exception of some obviously very high profile, very successful Gen Xers in government and industry? Do you have any thoughts about that role transition that we're seeing in the now?
Well, I think Gen X is really an interesting phenomenon, right? And it belongs to a type of generation we call nomad generations. And these are typically raised at a time when no one really cares much about kids, right? I mean, I was talking earlier about throwaway generations. This is the generation that grew up with all the childish devil horror movies, and everything about their generation was bad and contemptible. I mean, let's face it. As soon as they came along, and I think I often say that the Gen X attitude toward themselves is a little bit like the child of divorce writ large. I mean, America was doing great until we came along, so we must be at fault. There must just...
I've certainly felt that.
Bad seed. You remember that movie, Bad Seed? Anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But again, and I do think that when Gen Xers came of age, the whole attitude was most of us were doomed, and only a few of us will be lucky enough to survive, which has actually led this generation to be very much of a contrarian generation, individualistic generation. I'm only getting ahead by being different from my peers. So they've resisted big brands. They've resisted going along with the crowd. They've been very good contrarian investors. They're really good on those short funds. You know what I mean? I'm going to spread that. I'm going to go negative on this or that.
A lot of doomers. Yeah.
Millennials are completely different. So millennials, we got all band together, and they're all investing in target date funds.
Yeah. But that
they're all investing in the S&P 500. But here's the difference: Gen Xers felt that the only way they could survive is by taking their life rafts and sailing in different directions, because the whole thing was going to sink. Millennials are roping all of their lifeboats together, because they realize if the entire S&P goes down, someone's got to save them. You know what I mean? It's actually pretty clever, and I think they're right, actually. But it's a very different collective self-identification. And I do think for Gen X, the whole problem of maturing is, how do you get a mature role as a leader of institutions, as a cornerstone of the community, when you've grown up thinking that you were past the end of history, and not only did no one care about you, but the world would be better off if you just didn't take part. And I know a lot of Xers, and this is one of the reasons why they had this very libertarian and very often overtly sort of, counter hippie or counterculture image. I raised Michael J. Fox earlier as an example of this
Right.
generation in the early 80s. But this generation has always leaned more Republican all of their life in every election than the electorate as a whole. And now this generation is the #1 MAGA generation. They voted more for Trump than any other generation, right? So they deem themselves to be beyond democracy, beyond all this idealistic crap. We're in this world of survival. And maybe from time to time, we need a strong man to come in, cut corners and kick heads, right? But I do think there's also this issue of, so who's going to take care of, the little platoon, my family, my community. And many of this generation are raising their own kids the opposite of how they were raised, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is raised with Judy Blume, the silent generation, just expose your kids to everything and leave them at home and let them find out everything for themselves. That way they'll be better inoculated for how horrible the world really is. And Gen Xers are raising their kids and have raised their kids. Many of them are getting older now. Many of them are obviously in their 20s and so on, getting older, but they are raising their kids extremely protectively. And we have seen this pattern generationally time and time again. The last generation we saw that was like Gen X was the lost generation, right? Of F. Scott Fitzgerald and George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower. And, they were the ones who were the doughboys that got mowed down during World War I, a war that everyone hated and thought was pointless, right? And they came home to no victory tape parades for them very much. They came home to the Spanish flu and America thinking that our involvement in Europe or anything was
and then eventually into the Great Depression. Yeah.
And eventually their peak years were in the Great Depression. And they too, though, as parents, I mean, you can look at Harry Truman, look at Hemingway in his letters to his daughter, look at Fitzgerald in his letters to his daughter. They were incredibly protective, right? And they were also very much a generation of pragmatists. You know what I mean? Anti-idealists, just deal with the situation, right?
What's right in front of you, which feels very true. Again, as a midlife Gen Xer with my kids in their 20s, I mean, I'm pretty much the stereotype you're talking about. That feels very real. And when I look around sort of the community of folks that I know broadly, that feels very real. But this next transition, right? We've raised our kids, we've gotten them out there, whether we overprotect them or not, whether they're successful or not, whatever we did, we all had our path because we're all humans. Now we're sitting here, maybe we're in a business, maybe we're in politics, but more likely we're sort of late career, 50s, 60s folks who are now increasingly being looked to be elders for the millennials and the Zoomers coming up behind us, to impart wisdom, to do all these things we expect elders to do. But to your point, as nomads, we haven't necessarily leaned into those kinds of responsibilities throughout our lives. How does this play out? I mean, if you look back at the lost generation, what did their eldership look like? And can we learn anything about sort of graduating into eldership as a Gen Xer from them?
Well, what they did was they were thrown into a world which seemed to be falling to pieces, right? I mean, this is a generation that reached midlife at a time of both the Great Depression, when nothing seemed to work economically, like unemployment double digits, GDP cratering, and also huge transitions, enormous volatility in the markets. I mean, the America came back in 1935, 36, and then went to this huge vertiginous slide again in 37, a 50% decline in the stock market. It wasn't just downs, it was up and downs, it was roller coaster, right? And enormous political transition, of course. This was one of the great realigning series of elections, 1932, 34, and 36.
Which feels pretty real now. Yeah.
Another series of realigning elections. In fact, I will tell you that many people are calling, 2016 through 2024 to be America's, seventh great realigning election period. We've had them in every crisis and every awakening on cue, since the 1790s. So this is right on schedule, right? I mean, the big transition this time is working class kind of moving Republican and educated and professional moving to the Democrats, right? So, but it's completely changing politics. And I think the enormous pragmatism of the honey badger style of the Trump presidency, just rip everything apart, try everything, smash things against the wall, see what works, right? This is kind of the soul of pragmatism. Forget about what you've learned. They don't teach you how to govern the Trump presidency in graduate school. You know what I mean? It's not there at Wharton, and so this is the style. And when I look at those signal chats, you know what I mean, with J.D. Vance and Pete Hegseth, Europeans, they're just pathetic. You know what I mean? And it's all like in caps, pathetic. This is Gen X as America's leaders. Get used to it.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
That unfortunately,
no longer the respectable man with the respectable language, the multisyllabic phrases, right? No. This is shoot from the hip, say exactly what you think. And if it doesn't work, hey, I'll try something else.
Yeah, I see that on the national stage, right? That's been very easy to see. Part of the reason I loved The Fourth Turning is here so much is because it did put the pin in a lot of these things in a way that just sort of made you go, aha. But in that context, you also talk about sort of the scenarios that we have for how we get out of this over the next 4 to 10 years or whatever it is. And you sort of effectively point to 3 outcomes off the top of my head. One is we have effectively a form of civil war, whether it's guns in the streets or just even more, disruption than we've had already, or we have some sort of external crisis, which, maybe we're in the middle of that one. It's always hard to know while you're in the middle of it. Or we end up with sort of an internal realigning that sort of, I think you would call it a second regeneracy, where we sort of rebuild some institutions, we allow a few things to die and work from the ashes, but we're not done yet.
It's a little bit more decisive than that.
Okay.
Right? The next regeneracy, whether we have 2 regeneracies, 3 regeneracies, ultimately leads to a consolidation. When the country feels that its very fate is at stake, right? When the dissolution of everything we stand for seems to be in the balance, right? Whether or not we survive or fall, either to a foreign invasion or dissolution from within, right? That's the consolidation. We haven't reached that yet.
Right.
But I'm saying this is still there in the near future, right? And that ultimately that leads to the crisis. Right. And then after the crisis, you finally have the conclusion when all the treaties are signed and all the institutions are chopped off. It's basically we had in 1946 when suddenly not just the UN but the IMF and Bretton Woods and the World Bank and
we rebuild everything.
And NATO. Suddenly you had, and at that time all the cement, which was very fluid when all these huge institutions were being constructed, suddenly begins to harden. You know what I mean? And then you have, 2.5 decades of the American high, which was this period of incredible institutional stability, albeit a time when the world was rapidly changing, but America felt master of its fate, right? Individualism was not highly prized, but Americans felt like they were more than the sum of their parts.
Right.
They felt individually perhaps not terribly powerful, but that was okay because collectively they strode the world. You know what I mean? And that was from Truman, through Eisenhower, through Kennedy, then got kind of going in, things began to fall apart in LBJ, right? That's when he entered the awakening. But that's how America felt, which is very characteristic of a first turning. And at that point, Gen X is the senior leaders. You know what I mean? Right. Where at that time, the lost generation was the senior leadership generation. And of course, increasingly you had this pushy, aggressive, very ambitious GI generation who wanted to do much bolder things with government, right?
Is it the nomads? Is it the Gen Xers or the lost generation that ultimately sort of rebuild, instantiate, and give authority to the new institutions? Or does that happen behind us? Is that the millennials that show up as the heroes to rebuild?
The millennials behind you, by the time they reach senior leadership positions, they take all the stuff that you've built, right, rendered secure, rendered, the revolution of common sense has finally, run
Right.
its full course. And then you suddenly have these new, secure, but still young institutions that nonetheless, you as leaders don't want to be too risky with them. You understand what risk is all about. I always say Generation X knows about risk better than any other generation. They were suckled on risk, right?
Duck and cover,
millennials,
man.
millennials are terrified at risk, right? I mean, that's the
Yeah.
difference, right? But Dwight Eisenhower was a very risk-averse president, and I think very much in the style of his generation. He wanted to make sure the Soviets were in their place. But he did not want to do anything adventurous. He did not want to start new wars. He wanted, right, and it worked. And over that period, America suddenly became more prosperous, and we suddenly gathered momentum. But the next generation, the GI generation, as Jack Kennedy liked to say, they wanted to take longer strides, right?
Mm.
And they wanted a great society, as LBJ said. Those dreams of FDR had been put on hold by these lost generation presidents, who, let's face it, many of them were Republican. It was like Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah, we had to come to terms with Social Security, but that's it. Don't want to do anything. You know what I mean? But no, this new generation wanted new things, right? It wanted a great society. It thought we could have guns and butter. We could fight wars in Southeast Asia and bring the final fruition of what FDR started, right? Another New Deal. And we could go to the moon, and you know what I mean? We could do lots of stuff. And maybe at the same time, let kids explore their inner world. Oh yeah, that'll turn out just great. So at Woodstock, you had helicopters ferrying bottled water and ferrying food to these kids. I mean, who knows? They may know something we don't know. You know what I mean?
Right.
There was no sense of caution in that generation when it came to big collective risk. Individually, they were very risk averse, I think, like millennials. And if history does have one lesson, it's that as we grow individually more risk averse, we often grow collectively more likely to take risks. And that's something very interesting to think about in the context of the fourth turning. Individually, we've become much more a society that wants to be sheltered. You know what I mean? We want safety nets. We want someone to look after us. Everyone talks about the Fed put, the Trump put on the market. Believe me, if we had another thing if we had another crash like the GFC, I mean, we'd have Feds just start replacing everyone's paycheck, just like we did in COVID. I think actually the circuit breaker now for misery is set at a very light point. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and I do think, despite what Trump says about, and I think he's pretty smart to say it, I don't mind having a recession early in my presidency. I'll be like Ronald Reagan, be mourning America by the time it ends. That's just smart. I mean, that's what he should be saying, right? But nonetheless, I think that the collective backstop is big for us. And what I'm saying is that history suggests that when society feels that it's entering its more collective mood of not wanting to take individual risk vis-a-vis others, it's more likely to take collective risks, right? Our entire society risking going this way or that, to make sure that we become something new, something different, something safer as a group. And I see that as a historical pattern, by the way.
Where does individual financial risk taking fit into that? Because certainly one of the stories of the last 5 or 6 years has been the rise of sort of YOLO financial nihilism, certainly in the US. I don't want to speak elsewhere, but whether it's, the endemic nature of sports betting, poly market, massive amounts of leverage, crypto, none of that feels like anybody being risk averse to me. That feels like a lot of risk taking behavior at the individual level. And I don't think it's true that that's just entirely folks under the age of 30. I think that's a pretty broad trend that we've seen in investment markets and entertainment markets. How does that line up with that idea of the sort of increasing conservatism?
I actually don't think it's not just, it's, I think it is people over 30 is my point. I think Gen Xers are setting the tone for that. But I also think there's a feeling among a lot of people, particularly by the time we got to the late teens, we got 5 or 6 years out of the Great Depression, the Great Recession, that everyone's playing with house money. The stock market is up so much. This is just paper money. I can play with it. I do see 2 big trends among millennials. One is, we talked about it earlier, target date funds and passive investing. That is not taking risks. That is making a very calculated judgment. I'm going to invest in the entire market, and that serves 2 purposes. First of all, this is very important among millennials. I'm not going to envy my buddies because they're going to be investing in the same thing I am. So, we either all go down together, which is okay.
It's community investing.
Yeah. Well, it is kind of community investing. And this is why everyone's worrying, and I'm one of them. I've written about this subject a lot. I worry a lot about passive investing as basically disabling the role of active investing and actually serving what financial markets is supposed to do is actually provide a good estimate of the value of firms, right? And I think to some extent in the last couple of years, we've even seen the entire world begin to invest in America because of this whole passive craze that we've gone on.
Yeah, and my whole career's been there. So I agree with you. We've had all sorts of unintended consequences from passive investing.
But I do believe perversely, it's the fact that everyone sees more strength in all duplicating each other. I mean, that's the weird thing about having, government as a backstop. I mean, that if, Apple or NVIDIA or Microsoft go down by 30% or 40%, that, their Chairman Powell is going to have an emergency press conference, and he's going to talk about the 5 things we're going to do right now to correct this. But if you have if you're investing in some little like on the Russell 2000, he's not even going to notice you. Do you see what I mean? It's like federal emergency insurance, If you don't want just your house, if your house has to burn down, I'm sorry, but you want all your neighbors' houses to burn down. Because then you're going to get aid, right?
Well, but this gets to an interesting question of the difference between sort of social mores, individual tendencies, community collectivism versus, liberalism versus conservatism. Like, that's one set of issues. But then there's also just raw economics, which are always intertwined. The rise of passive investing, the increasing role of government and finance, et cetera, the increasing use of private markets versus publicly regulated markets. Do those naturally follow a pattern along with everything else? I mean, do you see the first turning, the next awakening, foundationally changing sort of American democratic market capitalism? Or do you think that those are sort of too foundational to the way we do things now? And what we're really talking about is a lot of the economic stuff, policy for this tax or that tax, that kind of stuff.
Well, I did think that as the crisis intensifies, it doesn't matter whether it's internal or external. It doesn't really matter what it is. That what you go to is toward public mobilization of resources against whatever dangers out there. And at that point, then markets start getting harnessed to what society needs to do. And what do you need to do when you aren't as public? I'll tell you, there are 3 things. And it's always the same 3 things, by the way. It's basically tax, borrow, inflate. And you tax where you can, but of course you can't suddenly tax everyone for everything. You get people to invest in the future, that's the bond drives, and then you inflate. And what people don't understand is that late in a crisis, inflation is always part of it, because inflation is not a problem in that case. It is a solution. It's a burden-sharing device.
Right.
You take from all the creditors who have nominally, denominated assets. You basically say, we're asking a lot of other people who don't have your wealth. This is what you're going to do. We're going to take that real wealth from you, and we're going to do it through inflation. And that was done through World War II in the late 40s. And if you look at why, and not just America, but most of the Western world became more equal, during a little bit during the 30s, more rapidly during the 40s, and then the first turning, the American Eye, the 50s and 60s, a lot of it was a combination of inflation, crisis, actually taking away people's wealth. Obviously, there's also just destruction,
Right.
and rapid economic restructuring in industries, and also financial repression. And here I want to get to something that should be on the minds of all investors, right? Financial repression is not just enough to say, yeah, we're going to have an inflation rate of 12%, even though your bond is only getting 4.5%, which was the case during World War II. But we're going to force you not to sell that bond. In
Right.
fact, we're going to require you to buy more of them if you're a bank or if you're various financial institutions. This is called financial repression. And this we are going to have, we always do. It's what they did during the Civil War. Samuel Chase actually distributed the greenbacks to pay for the war. He set up all these new federal banks, and they were required to take greenbacks, and they're required to take U.S. debt to issue the greenback. I mean, in other words, this is what happens. Everything starts to be harnessed around these, the community's desire to survive and overcome whatever adversity it faces. And a lot of the stuff you describe, betting on AMC and all the crypto stuff and everything, that falls by the wayside. I mean, obviously, the overall stock indices revalue, and in his own weird way, you could say this is this is part of Hegel's cunning of history. Donald Trump is getting us used to that. You know what I mean? He's getting used to extraordinary volatility in markets, and he's getting used to, I don't know, even the craziest stuff when he says, we'll only have $2 for Christmas. There's this, Donnie $2, there he is, getting us used to it, coming down, right? But I'm thinking, I'll say one thing about Trump that is probably accurate, what he accurately foresees, and is that Trump, however blunt-edged and chaotic his instruments for affecting it, he's often very prescient at seeing where the country's going, right? I thought in 2016, he was one of the few people who foresaw that globalization was going to reverse, right? And indeed it was. And that America culturally would be shifting direction, in a more conservative direction. And I think we've seen that actually in the last few years. We certainly see among, younger people now coming of age. So I see a lot of these things he saw. I think by and large, the whole idea that America will be, a number of years from now, who knows how long it's going to take, is a nation that's going to have much higher net exports and a much higher net savings rate. However wrenching that transition is, we may be facing much higher prices for certain goods. We may have certain goods just not there on the shelves. This whole idea of reindustrializing America, at least part of America, parts of some industries reindustrialized, is going to be enormous, painful, difficult process. It's not going to be just a few months. It's not even a few years. It'll take maybe a decade. It'll go way on into the next first turning. But you have to realize that if you are going to shut down imports and exports, you're also going to shut down capital inflows and exflows, right? That means we're going to have to fund our entire deficit on our own, which we haven't done for the last 20 years. That's going to lead to much higher interest rates, totally aside from the inflation premium on it. And it suddenly means we're going to have to do something about the deficit. All of these things kind of follows, like A follows B follows C. If you're not going to have the rest of the flip side of our trade deficit is foreign capital inflows. And if you're not going to have one, you're not going to have the other. And it's interesting. I often feel that it is, so long as Trump is willing to say that we should suffer some pain now to get some gain later, I often wonder, instead of all this tariff stuff, why not just start cutting the deficit? I mean, really, it's not this Doge idiocy, right? Which isn't doing anything. I mean, he's basically firing people who administer Social Security benefits, which is not even a rounding error. You know what I mean? In other words, you have to really do something
You have
about.
to like renegotiate the contract between America and its citizenry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's exactly what you have to do. And he's not doing that. And I will say, obviously, one reason he doesn't do it is it's not something you can blame on other people. It's just
Yeah, I think there's like to rewrite the American contract requires a level of and people have to allow you to do that, and I don't think Trump has earned that
well, he has
position with enough of America to be able to renegotiate that contract. And I think to some of the comments that you make in Fourth Turning is here, like you have to get through a crisis that is nearly existential before anybody's going to get that kind of authority.
And at that time, you can. At that time, you can renegotiate it, and it'll be up to Gen Xers who say, "Oh yeah, no problem."
Yes or no?
You know what I mean? No problem. I got it. I'll do it. Just give me 15 minutes. I'll give you a number. This is what I love about Gen Xers, by the way. They're unweighed by all the bullshit. It's just, yeah, you're right. I see it. The bottom line. I'll give you the numbers in 15 minutes. And that's
that's fair. You commented recently in some of your appearances about sort of how the sort of seculum, the cycle, seems to be sinking more and more globally as we become a more global society. You talked about sort of Israel perhaps being right in the culmination of their crisis at the moment. If that's true, if we project that forward and we say, okay, we should be expecting similar patterns elsewhere, certainly in the culturally common world. Is there some risk that effectively somebody gets there before us and builds institutions that we find preferable to those we might build ourselves?
Well, that's an interesting question. And by the way, when you say sinking, you mean S-Y-N-C.
S-Y, yes, S-Y-N-C, not S-I-N-K.
So I think the answer is obviously yes. I mean, look around the world. I mean, I'll just start at random, right? Look at Vladimir Putin, who's completely rebuilding Russia around this militarized anti-Western state. I mean, he's building a war machine, and suddenly in Russia, instead of the army being this horrible place where uneducated refuse goes, it's the time for heroes. You know what I mean? He's giving these huge benefits now to veterans. He's lifting the incomes of these rural communities, and so there's this huge recasting going on. And the idea of some people in the White House that, Trump can be suddenly brought over to the West or distracted from Ukraine, I think is idiocy. I think he is this close to Xi right now, right? The two need each other.
Right.
Xi needs Trump for energy and for agriculture, right?
I'm sorry, you mean Putin. You mean Putin. Xi needs Putin.
Oh, yes. Right. That again. I guess I haven't said that. Xi needs Putin for energy and for foodstuffs, right? And for strategic depth. I mean, he needs that. And obviously Putin needs Xi because
everything from the China.
The incredible power of his economy. But think of all these rulers, right? These are all, we would call them boomers. They were born after World War II. They were born after the great crisis that we saw in all their countries. I mean, take a look at Narendra Modi in India to talk about another flashpoint. Now we have Pakistan, India to worry about, right? Two nuclear armed powers that are now lobbing artillery shells at each other. These again are the seniors who were born after the last crisis. The crisis in India was obviously creation and partition of in 1947, right? And then you have this this post-catastrophe generation in China and throughout the Western Pacific of World War II and the Chinese Revolution, right? Horrendous time. And this is the new generation. And here's what they all have in common, whether you're talking about Russia, Iran, India, China. I mean, you go around the world, nobody alive today was an adult during the last crisis. They have all passed away.
Which is kind of always true, right?
And that's always true. That's the amazing thing about the saculum, right? Is the era we're entering is exactly the era that no one any longer remembers.
Right.
And it's interesting because recently we've seen all these 80-year anniversaries. It's 80-year anniversary of BE Day. I believe that was 2 days ago, right? And there you had Hitler's, I don't know, in a few days, Hitler's going to shoot himself in the head, in his bunker and all this stuff. Eisenhower sends his victory telegram, just like an Xer. The victory telegram was only about 50 words. That was it. The Allied forces have accomplished their objective at something 100. That was boom. That was it. That's all Eisenhower telegraphed back home. And then this obviously this August, we're going to have the 80th anniversary of Nagasaki, Hiroshima, the signing of the treaty on the deck of the battleship and all the rest in Tokyo Bay. And so it's funny though, we're all reliving this. We realize that anyone at this 80th anniversary who was age 20 at the time has to be a centenarian, right?
Yeah.
And we don't have a lot of them left. We have some. They're I don't know, they're about 400, 500,000 left, but they're departing they're shrinking at about 1/3 every year, right? So this is but this is interesting, isn't it?
It's us up to repeat it.
Yeah.
Does this rebuilding, the sort of expyrosis, the burning through fire and rebirth where the wildflowers can bloom, does this have to be state oriented? I guess that was the point I was trying to make about institutions. I look at something like the rise of Bitcoin, just to be really specific about it, as in a way its own stateless institution. Is there a path you see forward where these aren't hard drawn lines on a map and are instead either culturally or ideologically drawn lines where we build institutions across borders, or is that just pipe dream?
It's not necessarily state driven. That's not the essential part of it. Here's the essential part of it, Dave. It's community driven. It's this intense community of the whole country becomes a band of brothers. That's what the society we learns. You cannot understand the American high. You cannot understand why we were the way we were culturally, socially, the suburbs, the huge middle class, everyone wearing the same gray flannel suit. I mean, everything you remember of the late 40s, 50s, and I'm saying literally remember, but our image of that period, you cannot understand it without understanding the crisis that scared the crap out of everyone that they had been through, right? Coming together was the only thing that saved them. And the generation which came of age in that what we call the greatest generation, that power of community is something they recall for the rest of their lives until the time they died, whether it was in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Many of them were still voting for Ronald Reagan. You know what I mean? But my point is that that's what they could not stand about their boomer kids. Their boomer kids all wanted to be individuals. And they just thought, don't you realize what the only reason we were able to build all this crap for you spoiled kids is that we were together. We believed in community. We're willing to tax everyone for these interstate highways and all these sewer systems and all these public colleges, which you kids didn't pay a dime to go to. I mean, I was at California at the time. I went to UC San Diego, UC Berkeley. I think my semester tuition was something like $25. I mean, that's all I paid.
That seems like a late cycle problem because like even in the 80s, my college tuition now was like less than a car payment,
because we discovered markets. We thought they were beautiful. Right. So anyway, but here's my point is that the fundamental insight of so much of social science and this was Max Weber and this was Emil Durkheim, and this was even in America, we had William Graham Sumner and many others, right? But their fundamental insight, and they were all focused, by the way, on community. This is the time these huge cities were growing throughout Europe and America, and everyone was losing community. So the fundamental subject of the great first generation of social scientists was, where does community come from? And I would say their common conclusion, but one of the axioms of social science, as Robert Putnam, put it in his book Bowling Alone, is that conflict is the incubator of community. It happens every time, right? And the reason why these nation states are so powerful and embody community is that repeatedly in the entire modern era, these conflicts have always worked to the aggregation of power in the nation state. Where do you think the nation state came from? After the Renaissance, when America was divided up in all these little duchies and communes and everything, well, these what they called the new monarchies, coming out of the late 14th and 15th and early 16th century, these new monarchies, they built big armies, they conquered these duchies, they conquered these rebel nobles, they enlisted a greater bureaucracy, they were able to extend their tax take, they were able to give more peace, greater commerce, greater productivity, more revenue, bigger armies. I mean, you see where this is going.
Oh, yeah.
This is a positive cycle of nation building. And ultimately, of course, by the 19th century, nationalism was considered a right of every people, by Woodrow Wilson. That's why we went to war, right? To allow every nation to have nation to have its own nation, right? Every cultural nation.
Well, and even the Marshall Plan was largely about respecting that belief system that Japan still had a right to be a country called Japan, et cetera.
We even were willing to extend the Marshall Plan to Eastern Europe. But Stalin, he nixed that idea. I don't know why, but just said, and it was funny because all these Polish leaders and particularly Yugoslavia kind of independently saying, oh, can we? I mean, it looks really great, No.
Well, we know where that ended. Neil, I don't want to take too much more of your time. I want to close back on this issue of sort of emerging elderdom. I think you've really articulated for me a lot of what's emerging in terms of community formation, how the mores of society are changing as Gen Xers that are aging into elderhood, coming from our latchkey, nomad, ignored backgrounds. Is the implication that our focus as elders should be on helping form and support those communities that emerge during these crises? And that those communities eventually become institutions, which then the millennials will take over and run? Is that sort of the path for us here?
Yeah. I mean, Xers will be, believe it or not, the solid anchors of their community, of their whatever community you're talking about, even a neighborhood community or whatever kind of community
Politics
you're talking about. They will be the solid anchor at a time of tremendous crisis. They will be the no-nonsense, pragmatic bottom line at a time when everyone around them is losing their minds. And in this, I will say, and combine that with a very protective style of nurture of their children, and it's a real contrast. And I will say, Xers will be the builders of walls, the creating of institutions that actually restrain people from being wild, right? This is kind of Eisenhower's role, strengthening the community. And you consider what an ironic role for Xers who learned to get along without any community.
Well, this is sort of my point. It's like, we haven't trained on this.
But this is exactly the yin and yang of the generational cycle, right? It's always the generation that's the least used to something that actually brings it back. And that's the amazing part of it. And I will tell you, at the other end of the cycle, and many Xers will be able to relate to this, many Xers had parents, particularly the older Xers, I would say those born in the 1960s, had parents in the silent generation, right? These were the children of World War II and the Great Depression. And the silent generation came of age famously conformist. In college, their motto was, don't do anything don't do anything outside the lines. Our goal isn't to change this. The GI generation, the greatest generation, was also a huge generation of almost revolutionary change. Many of them joined the Communist Party. Many of them were socialists. They ended up conquering half the world. This was a dynamic generation institutionally. The silent generation, their motto just after World War II was, we don't want to change the system. We want to work within the system. And they all got these higher degrees as being the tinkers and technocrats of the system. It would improve on the stuff that older generations were building. They were very conformist, right? And many of them took no chances. They married their first date in high school.
Right.
And they did very well economically. I mean, many of them joined unions and got married and bought cars practically age 20, 21, right? Just coming out of high school. But many of them regretted all that early conformity. And so many of them had the midlife crisis, the late divorce and,
Right.
all of the, in kind of a wilder time. So here's the contrast is that the silent generation played by the rules totally when they were young. And ultimately by midlife, their problem was claustrophobia. They just never knew what it was to break the rules and just step outside and take bigger chances. And so that's what they did. They had a much more experimental late life role in public leadership and in private leadership. I think Xers is just the opposite. When they were young, they could do anything they wanted to.
Yeah.
They didn't give a crap. And their problem coming into midlife was what we call agoraphobia. The fear of just endless, open, unlimited distance with no time horizons, no barriers, no structure. So what the hell are you going to do that makes any difference in a world like that, right?
Right.
So it is their job to rebuild the barriers. See what I mean? There is something archetypal in this. And again, we see these roles happening again and again. The silent generation and the Nistaban awakening in midlife, and they side with the boomers in this, right? These younger boomers, I really envy them. They're doing all this as teens. I wish I could wear my long hair like that, but I'll help them break down the system.
Right.
I think with Gen Xers is that, I'll help millennials build the system again. And I'll help build some of these things, and I'll kind of teach the millennials how to do it in a pragmatic way. So I do see a very distinct role for Gen X, not only later in the crisis, but certainly throughout the first turning to follow.
Great. Well, Neil, this has been unbelievably helpful just in my own thinking about my own life. I hope the listeners find it that way as well. Where can people find work that you're doing you want to point people to?
For now, it's just Demography Unplugged. We do a weekly podcast on world events. So that's, and I my day job is investment advising institutions. I'm head of demography at Hedgeye Risk Management. So
great. Well, thanks very much, Neil. And hopefully we'll get to talk again soon.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and tell a friend. No information in this podcast should be construed as investment advice. Securities discussed in the podcast may be holdings of the participants or their clients.